the agrarian crisis that Indian agriculture is going through is a product of, it is at least part of the package of neoliberal economic reforms which were initiated. And also it's very much a crisis of neoliberal agricultural development rather than agricultural backwardness. One way of looking at this crisis is the onslaught of is to see this as an onslaught of global capitalism on petty commodity production in Indian agriculture, because that's the dominant form where independent producers producing for the market, using inputs from the market, but at the same time who are not able to accumulate through the process of commercial agriculture. Now, in response to this crisis, and it has been, I think, clearly established that the income from agriculture for a large section of Indian peasantry is not enough for them to sustain themselves, and hence the twofold response has been: one, to migrate out to the urban informal sector as precarious workers, or to diversify their livelihoods within the rural non-farm economy. However, when we look at the scenario of crisis, as Vikas was rightly pointing out, each crisis also is an opportunity for one section of peasantry, and particularly those who have been able to diversify their assets to money lending or to reinvent themselves as commission agents, so on and so forth. They seems to be doing better. Secondly, the linkages between this out-migration from agriculture and petty commodity production is not yet been conclusively resolved to my mind. On the one hand, it might be seen as a move away from agriculture, and on the other hand, the remittances from migration might indeed be used in agriculture, thus providing a new lease of life to petty commodity production. The third aspect is, of course, the regional unevenness in the process of the unfolding of agrarian crisis, and particularly when the significance of agrarian accumulation for the larger accumulation process of capitalism is declining and has even been declared as insignificant. It is better to look at the unevenness of the crisis through a regional political economy angle, not only to identify specific factors or specific trajectories of agricultural development in this phase of capitalism, but also to look at how these regional specificities play out in the trajectories of development. The focus of my research is on Arunachal Pradesh, which is located a mountainous border state located in northeast of India. And as you all know, northeast India is generally thought of even in India as a very homogeneous region, but this region is incredibly diverse in different ways. However, from the perspective of neoliberalism, the hope for this region lies in reinventing it as a gateway to the economies of Southeast Asia and elsewhere. So from the enchanted borderland or the exotic borderland, now it is being sold as India's gateway, as a kind of corridor linking mainland India to other economies in the east. So, however, this way of this vision of development, which is very much part of the neoliberal restructuring for the region, is premised on development of transnational road networks, development of hydropower, mining, but it also has got something from agriculture. It basically believes that the way for agricultural development in the region is through a process of integration of its horticultural products with the markets within and outside India. Basically, horticultural product, niche products such as medicinal plants, so on and so forth, linking these agricultural products with the global market, and that's the basic vision for this region in the neoliberal imagination. The point that I'm going to try to argue is that, however, this vision for development through such transnational linkages is based on certain institutional assumptions which are at odds with the institutional reality of the region, and that's why I need to go back this is Arunachal Pradesh, located in the northeast of India, and then the crucial fact about Arunachal Pradesh is that although it has in various periods it has a per capita income which is slightly higher than the Indian average, it has also a poverty rate that is higher than the Indian average. So Arunachal Pradesh is populated by around 26 major tribes, 126 minor tribes, so on and so forth. But the significant fact about this particular region being integrated to the larger circuits of capital is the way this integration was negotiated between the indigenous communities, between the state and of course outside capital, and it raises questions as to when a relatively isolated subsistence-based economy where community rights are the major form of access to resources, livelihood resources, when that gets integrated into a capitalism of this kind, what kind of a transition results? And the other crucial factor, of course, is the role of the ecological variables, particularly mountain specificities in the transformation process. Very briefly, what are the specificities local specificities that I'm talking about? One, of course, is the ecological specificities of a mountainous state. Then the very specific kinds of legacies of interactions with colonialism. This area was marked as an unadministered area during the colonial era. So Indian state has to establish its administrative apparatus in the post-independence period, and then the specificities of having a borderland, and of course there was a war. So even today, much of the development interventions by the state is evaluated, it's seen through the lens of security, and that has got long-term impact for the kind of development projects, the kind of development interventions which are prioritized. Now, because of all this, state has emerged as the prime modernizing force in the economy and in the society, and that is why we find that a number of institutional features which are part of Arunachal's development are peculiar to the region, or at least to the state. For example, there are mechanisms which protect the indigenous rights over agricultural land. So agricultural land legally cannot be transferred to those who are not indigenous, defined as Arunachal Pradesh as scheduled tribes. And secondly, unlike in many other states, here the community rights over agricultural land and forests are protected, although the terms of this protection are ambiguous, and also these are not always implemented properly. Then of course there is restrictions on in-migration of labor in the form of inner line permit. I will broadly look at the institutional features, although it is based on a collaborative research over various periods. The first story that I would like to talk about is the emergence of private property rights over land. So the state intervention in agricultural development in Arunachal Pradesh has basically been focusing on the encouragement to get away from jhum cultivation or the shifting cultivation, and of course there is the initial response at least was to propagate, to popularize the standard green devolution technology even in this mountain region, and basically promoting commercialization of agriculture. However, this particular form of agricultural development was premised on the idea of the existence of a male farmer who can take decision, who is the primary decision maker, which was not the reality of the state. When we look at what was there, the system of collective property rights, these property rights didn't exist in isolation. These were of course part of a broader network of institutional mechanisms involving the community. And there were differences within the collectively owned property rights. There were clan-owned property rights. There were property rights where the whole village community was the owner. In some parts of Arunachal Pradesh, the right to ownership was derived through chieftainship, and of course, then there are part of Arunachal Pradesh where the Gompa, the Buddhist monasteries, they tried to derive a surplus from agriculture, and there the land relations were controlled. Land ownership was controlled to some extent by the monasteries. Over a period of time, however, we have seen the emergence of a form of informal transition towards property, towards private property. It's not a straightforward destruction of community property and emergence of completely private property. That has not happened. However, there is a gradual process of transition towards private property, where the right to right over use of the land as well as inheritance is recognized, but the right to transfer is restricted by the community. Again, there are lots of variations across villages, depends on the strength of the community institutions. However, these are informal in the sense that the state has not recognized these rights explicitly. So on the one hand, the state recognizes the collective ownership over land and forests, and on the other hand, through its various developmental initiatives, it tries to undermine the institutional basis of collective ownership, and that's why we find ourselves in a situation where there is no reliable data virtually on ownership of land, the distribution of land across different size classes, because this land has not been surveyed. Whatever little we come to know through the agricultural census is about operational holdings. There has been a decline in the average size of holdings. There has been increase in the share of small, marginal, and semi-medium holdings. However, medium and large holdings, there is an increase in the share of small and marginal and semi-medium holdings. However, there is by and large a decline in the share of large holdings. However, in the very recent surveys, we do find an increase in the share of large holdings. There has been little land alienation. If we look at the agricultural census data, 98% of the holdings are operated by scheduled tribe, but it seems that various micro studies point out that the tenancy is severely underestimated here, and there are reasons for that, because the tenants are mostly migrant laborers, and that is one of the reasons why probably it's not reflected in the agricultural census. There is low but rising landlessness. Again, there are two parts to this landlessness, the emergence of landlessness story. One is landlessness is primarily is the landlessness of migrant laborers, and the other is there are some to some extent in an uneven manner from within the indigenous community, there is landlessness which is emerging. However, this landlessness has to be evaluated in the context of two things: the role of community institutions in taking in at least in checking this growth of landlessness, and then the ecological conditions which favors a favorable land-man ratio. Tenancy in the form of sharecropping has increased, and most of the tenants are migrant tenants, and they do not have as you know, they cannot come without the consent from their landowners, because the inner line permit is something which they need to come to Arunachal Pradesh. The informal private property rights over land that I was talking about is of course a gendered process. In a collective village economy, when land rights are collectively owned, women are part of the community, but when it gets informally privatized, it is mostly in the case the land rights transfers to the male members. However, there is a recent act in 2018 where the state has also started to recognize the individual property rights over land. In a very indirect way, it says that the individual owners can lease out their land for 33 years, but doesn't specify the mechanisms through which individual property rights are recognized or are accepted by the state. Through various rounds of field survey, we have found that a new class of large landowners have emerged, although the majority of farmers are subsistence farmer with very low amount of land, and the kind of large landowners whom we can find in various parts of Arunachal Pradesh tells a story in itself. In areas where plain land is available, although Arunachal is a big state in terms of geographical area, not all that is available for agricultural purposes. But wherever agricultural land is available, we find, and paddy cultivation is the norm, we find that a class of landlords have emerged through the use of who have rented out their land to the migrant tenants. And they have used both agrarian and non-agricultural surplus in expanding their size of operation. But also particularly in the areas which were dominated by chieftainships, we find a shift towards plantations, where both migrant laborers who have come to Arunachal Pradesh to settle there, and those who migrate occasionally from the plantations of Assam are employed, but mostly it is through the use of traditional land rights and non-agricultural government subsidies that these states have come up. In parts of Western Arunachal Pradesh, we find horticultural gardens coming up, where traditional land rights and non-agricultural surpluses as well as government subsidies are being used. Then there is a process of commercialization from below, which has also led to commercial estates supplying vegetables to the plains of Assam and elsewhere. Here again, the traditional land rights as well as non-agricultural surplus play a significant role. Finally, there is land for speculative purposes. Land prices are very high in Arunachal Pradesh, so we find that there are lots of investment going on from members of the indigenous communities to purchase land, but the interests are not in agriculture. Along with this, the labor relations have also changed. It is again not a simple transformation from collective labor arrangements to wage labor. We see that there are in almost all villages that we surveyed, wage labor, exchange labor, and family labor coexisted. And of course, the extent of wage labor varied over a period of time, and tenant labor was also part of this process. Gradually, the collective labor mobilization has changed to such an extent that it has been reduced to a bilateral exchange among specific households. Then it becomes more specific, a simple exchange of few working days across different households. How wage labor contracts are not the norm yet, but we do find that tenant labor is at least in case of paddy cultivation and the tea estates, we find that wage labor is the norm, and in the paddy cultivation we find sharecropping with and without cost sharing arrangement is the dominant norms. The labor market itself was created by the state to build its infrastructure, administrative and security infrastructure. It brought labor from outside, and subsequently this migrant labor market was used by the indigenous population both in agricultural and non-agricultural purposes. But there is also a class of laborers who are not visible because they migrate as part of the tenant's family, and they work in agriculture as well as in non-agriculture. Among the various ways through which agriculture is being commercialized, one, as I have already said, is through paddy production, for example, where self-cultivation with family, exchange and wage labor is the norm for small and marginal farmers. There is also cultivation through migrant tenant laborers, and there is limited sale of output. In other parts, there is the smallholders sell in the local markets, limited commercialization. Primarily in West Kameng and other neighboring areas, we find that migrant tenants have leased in land, are producing vegetables through buyback arrangements and various kinds of interlocked transactions with traders and agents from the plains. Yeah. The purpose of saying all this is that these institutional arrangements which characterized the traditional economy of Arunachal Pradesh were embedded in the local institutional structures, and it did not create the kind of inequality which we see today, is because the binding constant of that economy, labor power, was under social control. However, through state intervention, labor market was created in this region. It was possible for those who were slightly better placed in the local economy to use the non-agricultural surplus. I'll come to that non-agricultural surplus in a moment. To use the non-agricultural surplus and the labor market, the labor available through labor market, to appropriate local resources. This is a process in which state, market and community institutions work together to create outcomes which can best be described as primitive accumulation from within. And with neoliberalism, with with the neoliberal thrust, with coming of hydropower projects in particular, this process has been accompanied by a process of primitive accumulation from outside, where various changes in the land relations and of course in labor relations are being instituted to allow for private plundering of community resources. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the way capital enters such spaces is negotiated through the pre-existing institutions, and of course the local ecology plays a role. I'll not go into those details, but it is important to note that the non-agriculture, the agricultural surplus story is probably like many other parts of India, but the non-agricultural surplus part of the story is through the nature of state intervention. In the initial period, at least, capital did not enter Arunachal Pradesh in search of labor, raw material, or even market. It entered Arunachal Pradesh to strengthen state power, and that is why the state, which did not have an administrative apparatus to begin with, it did not inherit an administrative apparatus from the colonial economy. In order to create that administrative structure, it tried to negotiate with the local institutional arrangement, thereby giving an artificial durability to these institutional arrangement, and hence it partially recognized the community rights to some extent, but the overall logic of capitalist penetration to this part of Arunachal Pradesh is busy undermining the collective institutional access to various resources. Can the community institution be thought of as an alternative to the onslaught of market? I have my own doubts, because community institutions have also started responding to the inequalities which have emerged as part of this very process. So we might find a process where both the coercive power of the state and the persuasive power of the community institutions will be used by capital to make further inroads to Arunachal Pradesh. I'll stop here. Thank you.